Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and this is a free 1-hour overview of the Olympus E-M1, the most powerful micro four thirds camera, a camera for very serious photographers. This is a part of a series covering many different types of cameras and how to use them. If you want to see a tutorial for a different camera, maybe you have a friend who has a different camera, visit sdp.io/tutorials. You'll see 1-hour tutorials for almost all the latest modern cameras. This overview is going to cover what I think are the most important facets of photography. So you'll learn how to configure shutter speed and aperture, as well as how to customize all these buttons, all the things that you need to get great pictures out of your camera. I am specifically not going to cover every feature that the camera has. I'm not going to cover things like Wi-Fi, which will probably change as they update the mobile apps, and is not core to photography. There are lots of special effects and in-camera editing apps that I don't find all that useful in the real world, and I'm not going to waste your time with those. Instead, we're going to focus on just those core things that will really make a difference in your photography. You probably know some of this stuff, because I'm going to show you how to put the lens on and such. If you do, you can skip past it. So check the description of this video for a full table of contents. You can jump right forward to any part of the video. If you know everything about your camera already, you can jump forward to the lens and tripod and strap suggestions that we have at the end of the video, just to show you the equipment that we use that we like the most. First, I'm going to show you just the physical controls on the camera. You probably already know how to attach the lens, but I'll show you how. There's a red dot on the lens and a red dot on the body mount there. Just line those two up, twist the lens clockwise until it clicks, and then give it a wiggle. Make sure that it's on there nice and tight. The battery is inserted on the bottom here. Twist that down and it pops open. You'll have to push that little switch. Slides in there. This camera does not charge via USB, so if you travel, you'll need to be sure to take your battery charger with you. It comes with a really long cable, which is a pain. But for a couple of dollars, you can buy a little replacement power cable. Search on Amazon, and it'll be about this big instead of being a 2-foot long cable, and that will plug right into the wall and save you some space in your bag. I would also recommend getting an extra battery if you're traveling with this, because the battery will run out by like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At least when I'm traveling, that's about when it runs out if you're shooting heavily like I am. The other port that you need to worry about is the memory card port. So I'll pull that back and then it flips open. This is the SD card. This is your digital film. You can get bigger SD cards. Don't feel like you need to spend a lot of money on an expensive SD card unless you're shooting sports or action. If you're taking advantage of that high frame rate, then you might start to buffer. You might start to run out of room in the camera's memory. It might not be able to keep up with you unless you get an expensive, higher-end, fast SD card. If you're shooting mostly still subjects and you're not taking pictures at 10 frames a second, I would get a big, cheap card, like a 128 gig SD card. You can find an inexpensive one for about $70 or so. Let's go over some of the ports on the camera. This camera has lots of little buttons and dials and such. Over on the left side of the camera here, you'll see mic and HDMI and USB ports that are hidden. Pull down the articulating screen like that and pull it out to allow you to get to these ports. This top one allows you to hook up a microphone. If you are recording video, this camera does have a microphone inside of it, but the audio is always going to sound terrible if you use that. For better results, hook up an external microphone. If you're recording somebody talking, you want to use a lavalier mic like the one I'm wearing here. We use EW100 G3 microphones. However, you can get less expensive microphones, especially non-wireless ones, but wireless ones really are nice and stop people from tripping, which will definitely help your video out. The bottom port it reveals an HDMI and a USB port. The HDMI port is for connecting the camera. Most of the time you'll use it to connect it to a TV. Maybe you're on vacation, you could bring a micro HDMI to full HDMI cable, hook it up to the TV in your hotel room, and play back pictures for your whole family to see. The USB port is primarily used for transferring pictures from this camera. So I recommend just pulling out the memory card from the side here, sliding it into a USB 3 memory card reader. That's just the fastest way to do it. If you don't feel like bringing a USB 3 memory card reader, you can just use a USB cable to connect it directly to your computer, and then it'll pop up like a flash drive. You'll be able to see all your pictures. But for the most part, you probably won't ever use the HDMI or USB port. There is one other port here on the front. This thing unscrews. You should never unscrew this. You don't ever need this useless port. It's a PC sync port, and I think they put it on there for historical reasons. Like, it's kind of a retro camera. PC sync ports are awful. You can use them to trigger flash or studio lighting. It's a universal port that has literally been around since I think the 1920s. It's 100 years old, maybe older, and it's a terribly designed port. It'll just fall out all the time. It's kind of unreliable. It'll probably work 4 out of 5 times, so it won't work every single time, and sometimes it just slips out. But if you need to trigger studio lights or something, every single modern studio lighting system is triggered by the hot shoe port on the top. So we just put a little connector in there, and it'll fire the strobes just fine. We use it in the studio. No problem at all. Don't uncover that PC sync port. Let's talk about how to actually take a picture. First of all, get your battery and your memory card in there. Let's turn the camera on with this switch over here. It comes to life. Now, by default, you might, instead of seeing live view on the back here, you might see this display. You can switch if you want to use a live view by pushing this button right next to the viewfinder there. Either way, when you hold the camera up to your eye, by default, it will automatically detect that the camera is to your eye and use the electronic viewfinder here, just like in an old-timey DSLR. So I'll take my first picture. I'll just lean over and take a picture of my cameraman, Justin, over here. That's all there is to it. You get a replay in the viewfinder if you're using that, which is the best thing about these mirrorless cameras. If you want to review the picture, you can hit the play button, flip through your pictures using the directional pad here. You can zoom in using the touch screen. Just touch the screen once for this to come up, and then you can use the slider here to zoom right in, and then you can pan around. That's really important because it's easy to miss focus. You can see that when I took the picture of Justin, the camera decided to focus on the camera instead of Justin. So by zooming in, I would realize that I need to retake that shot, probably using a single focus point, something we'll cover in just a little bit. While you're reviewing a picture, you can view different options by pushing the info button here, right above the directional pad. So I push that multiple times. It'll iterate through a couple of different groups of settings. So when I push it here, you can see it's showing me a histogram, which shows me the relative brightness of each part of the picture. Because the histogram is spiking on the left there, I know that most of the picture is dark. Stuff to the left is dark, stuff to the right is bright. We cover this in chapter 4 of Stunning Digital Photography, so it'll make more sense if you check that out. We have an RGB histogram here showing you the amount of red, green, and blue and how it's distributed in the picture across bright and dark. You can also see that it's showing you the shutter speed and aperture over here, the focal length, whether you had exposure compensation enabled, and other aspects of the picture. Hit info again, and you can just review the picture without all that gobbledygook. There are a couple of options you can configure for how you review pictures. I'll hit the menu button here, and then scroll down to the wrench icon here. And here we see the rec view, which is how long it's going to show you a picture that you just took. And right now it says half a second, which for me isn't long enough. I like a 4-second viewing time. So I'll click OK, and then I can just scroll up to set that to 4 seconds. So now if I take a picture, it's going to stay up there for a full 4 seconds before it goes away. That'll burn through your battery a little bit quicker. But that's kind of the minimum time I need to actually review my picture. Now I'll show you how to use the diopter. The diopter allows you to dial in your glasses prescription into the viewfinder here. So you can take your glasses off and look in the viewfinder and see everything as if you had your glasses on. It's so much more pleasant to use that rather than pushing the glasses up against your face. The diopter, even if you don't wear glasses, it's important to know about it because it can get turned accidentally and then everything will look blurry in the viewfinder, even though it won't look blurry in the live view. So it's this dial here just to the left of the viewfinder. You can see it twists up and down. To set it, which is important whether or not you wear glasses because it does get accidentally turned, just look in the viewfinder and twist it until the numbers at the bottom of the display are nice and sharp. Again, I want to stress because it's a very common problem. If you look in the viewfinder and it seems like your camera can't focus or everything is blurry, including the numbers, adjust that diopter. Now let's talk about the view options, the information that you see when you either look at the back of the screen or the viewfinder. First, as I mentioned earlier, there's a button to the left of the viewfinder that you can push to manually switch between the viewfinder here and the viewfinder there. Most of the time, you'll leave it set so that it will automatically switch as you hold your eye up. If you ever see the back of the screen and it just stays black like that and you can't figure it out, it's this button. It means you've accidentally set it to just the eye viewfinder. Just push it again and it will switch back to being automatic. Now, if we hit the info button here, we can start to see different sets of information. First, you can hit it until you just see an empty screen. And that's great for taking in the form and composition of a scene without worrying about the technical details. Push it again and you'll start to see other data like the shutter speed and aperture. You can see this particular view also provides me a virtual horizon. So it's telling me that my camera's level. The one on the right here is telling me about the vertical tilt. And this one here is showing me, oh, there, now I got it perfectly level. That's going to be a really useful view for landscape photography, especially if you're shooting the ocean where you have this perfectly flat horizon. You want to make sure you really nail it so you don't have to crop later. I'll hit the info button again, and now it takes that away, but it still shows me some useful data. Hit it again, and this is my favorite view. You see the histogram here. Again, the histogram shows you how bright or dark something is. And if it's all the way to the left, your picture is underexposed. If it's all the way to the right, your picture is overexposed. There are a couple of options you can configure about these views here. So I'll hit the menu button and we'll go down to the gear icon here, scroll to the right and go down to J. This configures the built-in electronic viewfinder up here. Oops, I accidentally triggered it. That's one of the annoying things about the automatic viewfinder. Sometimes you'll hit it with your hand and then the camera like resets. So you want to kind of be careful about that. You'll get used to it. You'll learn to avoid it. As I go to the right on the electronic viewfinder style here, you can see I can choose from 3 different options. For me, the default is the preferred, where it shows the entire scene and overlays the text. But if you don't like the text overlaying the scene, you can choose style 1 or 2. I'll leave it at style 3. There's some other settings here, like the EVF auto switch is currently on. As I showed you, it can get annoying. If you would rather switch it manually, you can go ahead and just switch it to off by selecting that. If you do change any of these settings, be sure to click OK. If you just hit menu without clicking OK to go back, it will forget your setting, and that will be kind of annoying. You can also adjust, say, the brightness of the electronic viewfinder. Most of the time, these settings are absolutely fine by their default, but I wanted to show you where they were in case you do want to customize the electronic viewfinder. Now I want to show you one of my favorite features, which is shooting with the touchscreen. I like to use the electronic viewfinder, but often you might be holding the camera out, or you might be holding it low to the ground with the articulating screen pulled out like that, or you might be holding it over your head with the screen pulled out. And in those cases, it can be difficult to focus and push the shutter button. You might even just be holding it out with your left hand. Touchscreen shooting allows you to touch the screen to both focus and shoot. Now, as we look at the live view here, there's a button right here to the left that controls touchscreen shooting. If you hate that, if you're accidentally touching it and taking pictures, just tap that until it shows you the finger with a line through it. That means no touchscreen shooting. It's going to ignore all touch input, almost all touch input. You can still swipe in from the right there. If you select it again, you'll see the finger with the box, and that means focus for me when I touch it, but don't actually take a picture. If you want to take a picture, you still have to use the shutter. Now let's get into the more nitty-gritty, switching into aperture priority mode. When you get your camera, it'll probably be set to either intelligent auto mode here or program mode. Both of those let the camera make most of the decisions. That's a good start. And if you ever hand your camera to somebody who doesn't know how to use a camera, that's the mode you should put them in. But we're learning how to use the camera and get the most out of it, so we're going to switch to my favorite mode, which is aperture priority. It's designated by the A there. Aperture priority allows you to use the main dial on the back here to control the lens's aperture. The aperture is the iris inside the lens. It's an opening, just like the iris in your eye, that gets really big when it's dark outside and really small when it's super bright. The aperture not only controls the amount of light coming into the lens, but it controls how sharp the background is. A little small pinhole like this gives you a completely sharp background. A really big, wide open iris gives you a very blurred background, something you'd want to use for portraits. In aperture priority mode, you use the main dial back here to control your f-stop. The f-stop is a measurement of the aperture. This makes no sense, but smaller f-stop numbers, like f2.8 on this lens, mean the iris is really big, and higher f-stop numbers mean the iris is really small. It's a fraction. So you're looking at the denominator of a fraction. That's why it's backwards like that. But an easy way to remember it is high f-stop numbers mean high background sharpness. Low f-stop numbers mean low background sharpness. So with this lens, it's an f2.8 lens. Your lens might be an f5.6 lens. It might have a different minimum f-stop number. At f2.8, I can see that the background here gets pretty blurry. I focus on the screen, and you can see the background there is very out of focus. If I crank that up to the maximum f-stop number, like f22, and take a picture, as we review it, we can see the background is quite in focus. Now, when I'm looking at the viewfinder, notice that I don't see that the background is sharp, even though I'm using a high f-stop number. It will not preview your depth of field by default, but this camera includes a depth of field preview button that allows you to see exactly what your final results are going to be. So as I push that depth of field preview button, you can see it's not changing the focusing point. It's still focused at the same point. It's just making the aperture smaller. So as I push that button, it all becomes nice and sharp and in focus. This is f2.8, wide open, and this is f22. That depth of field preview button is right here on the front. It's the bottom one. So push that to see the results of the higher f-stop number that you selected. The depth of field preview button does nothing if you have already selected the lowest f-stop number, because when you're framing your picture and preparing to take a picture, the lens is always at the lowest f-stop number. This is a lot to take in, I know, but Chapter 4 of Stunning Digital Photography not only explains exactly how aperture works and how you can use it to control the background blur, but every scenario which you should use low f-stop numbers or high f-stop numbers. So check out Stunning Digital Photography, and that'll make more sense. I'm not going to try to cover everything about aperture right now. Now let's talk about the shutter priority mode. Aperture priority allows the main dial here to control the f-stop. So I bet you know what shutter priority is going to do. We'll select shutter priority, and now the main dial will control the shutter speed. I should mention this camera has a locking mode dial, which is a great feature. I had it unlocked, so I was able to freely turn the modes. If your mode dial doesn't move naturally, then you'll need to unlock it by pushing in that center button and then turning it. Now, it's possible for the mode dial to get accidentally turned when you're throwing it in your bag or something, and for that you might want to lock it. But actually, the mode dial has enough resistance that it's never been a problem for me on this camera, and I usually just leave it unlocked. It's more frustrating when I can't change modes. So now that I have it set to S, shutter priority mode, the main dial in the back here is controlling the shutter speed. So now it's at 1/320th of a second, which is a tiny fraction of a second, a very fast shutter speed. If I scroll it to the right, it will get faster and faster, all the way up to 1/8,000th of a second. So at 1/8,000th of a second, you might take a picture of a hummingbird if you wanted to freeze the motion of the wings. It's very rare you'll use that kind of high shutter speed. Go down to about 1/2000th of a second for things like birds in flight, or perhaps professional level sports, very fast athletes. Most athletics, however, will be shot at 1/1000th or even slower 1/500th of a second. For things like high school and professional football or soccer, I'll most of the time be at 1/500th of a second. As a general rule, you'll select the slowest shutter speed you can to cancel out either camera shake or motion of the athletes. So, or motion of whatever your moving subject is. So I'll often take a picture of a subject who's moving and then zoom in and check it. And if there's no motion blur at all, I'll use an even slower shutter speed and repeat the testing process. If there is motion and I'm bothered by that motion, then I'll use a faster shutter speed. Once again, I go into much more detail in Chapter 4 of Stunning Digital Photography. As I keep scrolling the main dial to the left, you'll see the shutter speed gets slower and slower. And as I get down to like 1/200th, 1/250th of a second. That's where I shoot my daughter's soccer game. She's 11, so they don't move as fast as high school kids do. Slow down to 1/60th of a second, and now we're at a good general place for taking casual portraits. If you're out to dinner with your friends, 1/60th of a second is enough to generally freeze the motion of people who are kind of standing here and talking and not running around. Slower and slower, and we get into low light scenarios. So you might get down to 1/10th or 1/5 of a second when you're shooting a landscape picture at dusk. Believe it or not, with this camera and the fantastic IBIS, the in-body image stabilization, you can hand-hold shots at really, really slow speeds. Depends on your hand-holding ability and the lens that you're using. But you can shoot successfully at 1/5 of a second, especially if you take 5 or 10 pictures and then choose the sharpest of them. You can keep scrolling to the left, and once it says 2, again, it's a fraction. So we're talking about 1/2 of a second when it shows 2. But if you keep going left, eventually you'll see a little quote mark there. Now it's 1 second. That's what the little double tick means. Scroll to the left more, and I'm getting into multiple seconds of exposure, all the way up to 60 seconds exposure, 1 full minute. Now, 60 seconds is a long exposure, and you won't often use that. But if you're trying to expose a picture in the wilderness away from city lights and you don't have a full moon, that's what the kind of shutter speed that you would probably need. You'll often use shutter speeds of 1 or 2 seconds, even taking pictures in urban environments with lots of city lights. Now let's go on and talk about manual mode. While Aperture Priority allowed you to control the aperture with the main dial, and Shutter Priority changed the personality of the main dial to configure the shutter, manual allows you to control, it's marked by the M here, to control both the shutter speed and aperture using these two dials. So the back dial here, the main dial, controls the shutter just as it did in Shutter Priority. But now the secondary dial, the front dial, will control the aperture. So now you can see the camera is not adjusting the exposure automatically. So as I use a high f-stop number, which makes the opening really small, the picture got really dark. As I scroll to the left and I use a small f-stop number, the picture gets brighter. If I use a slower and slower shutter speed, you can see, well, it won't display the image any brighter, but it actually is getting brighter. If I were to take a picture now, we'd see it would be just about completely white. So it will only just preview the display up to a certain point. If you are using manual mode like that and completely taking full control of your images, I suggest hitting the info button until you see that histogram there. That will stop you from just completely and wildly overexposing your picture. Besides aperture and shutter speed, there is one other setting that you have to configure in manual mode, and that's ISO, the sensor's sensitivity. We'll discuss ISO in just a little bit. For now, I want to discuss bulb mode. Bulb mode allows you to use shutter speeds of longer than 60 seconds. To use bulb mode, you'll have to put your camera into manual mode, just as it is now, and then I'll use the main dial here at the back to make a slower and slower shutter speed. Once I get to 60 seconds, I'll go one more tick to the left, and the screen gets dark. That's normal, and it shows bulb here. Now, the screen gets dark because the camera assumes you're taking pictures in near darkness, and it doesn't want to blind you by showing a really bright electronic viewfinder. And that is the only time you'd really use bulb mode, is in absolute darkness when you need 2-minute exposures, 5-minute exposures, 10-minute exposures. There aren't too many scenarios where you really need this, but in the dark, dark woods, if you want to properly expose something, you might need that. Even taking pictures of stars, you usually want to stop at 30 seconds because you'll end up with star trails, which, by the way, we cover in Chapter 10 of Stunning Digital Photography. Now, the way bulb mode works is the shutter stays open as long as you hold the shutter button down. So I could push it and release it and make just a half a second exposure. Or I could make a 5-second exposure by holding my finger on the shutter button for 5 full seconds. Now, you probably won't want to stand there with your finger on the shutter for 10 minutes. Even if you had the patience, which I would not, your finger on the shutter would shake the camera a little bit, and that would ruin your long exposure. So in order to get a long bulb exposure, you'll need to purchase an external shutter trigger. It will connect into the USB port here, and that will allow you to trigger the camera and then lock that shutter open for the entire duration. It's not a bad idea to get one of those anyway. They kind of make star trails and things easier. There are a couple of configuration settings for bulb mode. I'll hit the menu button here. You know what? I want the screen to be bright again, so I'm just going to switch out of bulb mode. I'll hit the menu button here, and we'll go down to the gear icon and then go over to E. And here we have a couple of features, a couple of settings related to bulb mode. First is the bulb/time monitor. And you can see right now, as I scroll right, it's set to -7. And that's what caused the screen to get very dark. Again, that's a feature rather than a bug. The screen's supposed to get dark because it assumes you're taking pictures at night. If you hate that, you can scroll up to 0, or for some reason you could even make the screen darker. But most of us will just want to leave it at -7 because you wouldn't turn it on unless it were dark. There's also a time limit here for bulb mode. This will not leave your shutter open for a full 8 minutes. You can see it's set to 8 minutes. This is the maximum amount of time that the shutter will stay open. I don't know why they limit it, but you might go ahead and set it to 30 minutes. They limit it because you might lock the shutter open and forget to come back to your camera. You could use that if you were locking the shutter open also to set how long you were going to be in bulb mode, or how long the picture was going to be taking, how long the shutter was going to be open. But most of the external triggers that you use will have a timer built in. Therefore, you don't need to rely on that limiter. Take a quick moment to plug my 3 books, because photography is not about figuring out the buttons and dials on your camera. I know it's not simple, but that's kind of the easy part. And it's also kind of the not fun part. The fun part of photography is the artistic side of it. Learning to capture a moment, making a picture that tells a story, and then being able to show that in the picture and share it with your friends. There's so much to it besides buttons and dials. Composition, lighting, emotion, mood, storytelling, timing, getting the sun in the right place, figuring out how to get the right expression out of people. These are all lessons that I teach along with my wife in our book, Stunning Digital Photography. But if you don't like books, if you're a video person, it's a video book. It has 12 hours of video built in, 100 videos, short little videos that complement the book content. So if you're not into books, you can just watch the videos. But if you are into books, it's a full standalone book, and you never have to read the videos. For best results, read the book and watch the videos as you go. It also includes a lot of bonus content, like a Facebook support group with over 10,000 people, very active members who share their pictures and get feedback, and also get help with very specific problems that they have. The end of each chapter also has an optional quiz that you can take to not only assess how you learned the content in that particular chapter, but also allow you to think about the content. I find that going through the quiz helps you process the content and helps move the lessons into your long-term memory. That is what the quizzes are for, not to assess yourself so much, but just to make you think a little bit. It helps you remember things. Your pictures will get difficult to organize and find because you'll take enough pictures that you won't be able to find that picture of Bobby from June 12th. Lightroom is a fantastic app for organizing your pictures and for doing just about any editing task that you need. If you decide to get into Adobe Lightroom, something I do recommend, check out my book, my Lightroom 5 or Lightroom 6 and Lightroom CC book. We have different versions for both versions of the software, whichever one you have. It includes 12 hours of video. The Lightroom 6 and CC book has 14 hours of video and 250 free presets for you that'll make your pictures look fantastic. The lenses and flashes and tripods, all that gear can get very expensive very quickly. If you want to understand what you're spending all your money on and get the most bang for your buck, check out my photography buying guide. All these ebooks are only $9.99. This one in particular can save you thousands of dollars by allowing you to make more educated choices that will get the most bang for your buck. You can check all these out at the URL here, sdp.io/store. They're all available in either eBack or paperback. The paperback versions include the ebook for free, and you can get a bundle that makes everything even cheaper. So do check it out and support us. Now let's talk about the different shutter modes. The shutter is that thing that goes click and takes a picture. And by default, it will just fire up and take one picture. If you hold your finger on the shutter, it will just take a single picture. You can configure it to take continuous pictures, like click, 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 click. To change the shutter mode, there's a button dedicated to it on this camera, right here on the top. You can see it shows like a stack of paper. That's the universal symbol for shutter mode for some reason. Push that, and this display comes up. At the top here, no, at the bottom here, we see options for taking a single picture or taking multiple pictures. So I'll use this back dial, the main dial, to select different shutter speeds. The one I use all the time, I never use anything else, is sequential H there. So I'll select that and click OK. And now I can get that shutter speed down to a more reasonable speed. Now with that selected, I can hold the shutter down. Oh, a nice fast frame rate. I love this camera. This is not only great for action and sports where you need to take several pictures to capture the best instant and you can't possibly time it perfectly. It's also good for casual things like portraiture, because you'll find once you start taking pictures of people that people's expressions kind of change constantly, and the perfect smile might only last a split second. People blink, and if they blink in the middle of your shot, you don't want to have just that one shot. So even if I'm just taking a snapshot of a person, I'll hold it down and grab 4 or 5 frames, maybe even 10 frames, and then I'll go through and pick the very best one. Pictures are free now in the digital era, so it never hurts to have too many pictures and delete most of them. There are a couple of other shutter modes. If that 10 frames a second seems too fast for you, again, hit this button up here and use the main dial to scroll over to sequential L. It's just a little bit slower. Once you select that, it just goes a little bit slower. We'll hit this button again, and now we have a couple of delayed shutter options. The 12-second delayed option is good for those times when you put the camera on a tripod and you want to like run around and put your arm around your family and take a picture as a group. But I'll show you an even better way to do that in a second. Scroll over to 2 seconds, and this is good for night photography, still life work when you're working on a tripod. That 2-second delay, I'll push the shutter here. You'll see the orange light blinking, and then it takes a picture. This allows the camera to be more steady than if it just was triggered by your finger, because believe it or not, when you push the shutter button, that actually shakes the camera just a tiny amount. And that tiny amount is enough to make your pictures less sharp. So by putting a 2-second delay on there, when you're working on a tripod, you let that camera shake disappear and you will get sharper pictures, I promise. Push that shutter mode button again here and scroll over to the last option, which is the custom timer. And this is the one you want to use for the family portraits that you're included in. So once I select that, I can hit the info button, and this will allow me to take multiple pictures after a delay that I select. So what I'll do is scroll over to the timer here and scroll up to, let's say, an 8-second delay is pretty good for those self-portraits. And then this is how many pictures do you want it to take. So I'll scroll up and select 10 full pictures, which is the maximum amount. And then I usually like to have a full 1-second delay for these self-portraits. And usually what I'll do is turn off the every frame autofocus. If you have every frame autofocus on, the camera will try to autofocus between every frame, and it might miss focus. So it might focus in the background or something. And because you're not at the camera, you won't notice it. So again, we're talking about self-portraits here. So now I've configured the camera to wait 8 seconds before taking a series of 10 pictures. I'll hit the shutter button and the orange light comes on. Now's the moment when you step away from the tripod, you run around, you put your arm around your wife, and then it starts snapping pictures. You can see it's going to take 10 pictures with a 1-second delay between each photo. So for the first 3 frames, Bobby has like rabbit ears up behind his sister, and Aunt Ellie is elbowing you for some reason. But hopefully by the 4th or 5th frame, everybody's settled down, they've stopped blinking, and you can actually get a usable shot. So it's nice that you don't have to keep running back to the camera to take another frame because somebody messed it up. Whenever you use the timer, or really you change any setting for a specific shot, go ahead and reset it back. So I'm going to hold that button down and then go back to my favorite mode, which is sequential H. After your shoot, you want to set the camera back up to what you will generally need it for a general picture. Because the next time I pick up the camera, I might just want to grab a quick shot of the dog doing something stupid. I don't want to be like, oh, I have it on the timer and now I need to wait 10 seconds before I take a picture. Just reset everything back and you'll be happier about it. Now, I showed you the high speed and low speed sequential shutters. If that slow speed is still too fast for you, you can adjust it. I'm going to hit the menu button to go into the menu system here, and then go down to the gear icon and go to C. The third option down here is low frames per second. If I scroll to the right, you can see that by default, low frames a second does 6 frames a second. If that's too fast, I could have it do 3 frames a second and just slow it down a little bit. Be sure to click OK when you're done with that. You also have the option of changing the high speed frames per second. If I scroll to the right there, I can slow that down, though it's supposed to be high speed. Maybe 10 is just a little too fast and you want to do 9 frames a second. There is one other option related to the continuous shooting, and that's image stabilization. So by default, when you're in high speed mode and you're shooting continuously, it will turn image stabilization off. This just allows it to shoot a little bit faster. I don't like that. I actually like to have the image stabilization on in all scenarios. Now this turning image stabilization on will slow down the high speed shooting. So you might get something less than 10 frames a second. But that image stabilization can eliminate camera shake and just help ensure that you're getting nice, crisp photos. So that's why, in general, I'd rather have it turned on. Now let's talk about the different focusing modes. By default, this camera will find focus on part of the picture and then stop trying to focus. So you can see I focus there, but if I move the camera around, it's not continuing to try to find focus. If I zoom in, you can see everything's blurry. It's given up focusing because I'm still holding my finger halfway on the shutter button. That would be terrible for sports, right? Because if somebody's coming towards you and you were trying to take multiple pictures and you just had your finger on the shutter button, it would still be focused on where they were standing when you started taking pictures, and they've moved 5 feet forward. It hasn't changed focus. They're all blurry. So you want the camera to chase them, to continuously focus on them and track them as they move. To adjust that, press the AF button on the top of the camera here. This brings up a screen very similar to the last one we looked at. You can see by default it shows single AF at the bottom here. I'm going to use the main dial here to scroll over to continuous AF with tracking and select that. And so now, as I hold the shutter down halfway, you can see it locked in focus, but then as I move to the background there, it went ahead and found focus. So there is a difference between continuous AF and continuous AF tracking. Tracking is the one you want most of the time. You'll put the focusing point on a subject, and then even if it moves around, it will try to track it. So you can see there, it's trying to track that O. That's pretty cool, right? It'll stay on the same face. Even if your camera moves around a little bit, even if you recompose a little bit, it'll try. It's not perfect, but it does a pretty good job. Push that AF button again and scroll over to regular continuous AF without the tracking, and you can see it behaves differently. Now, it's found focus on the middle focusing point, but it's not trying to track the O or anything. It will just always focus on whatever is in the middle of the frame. So that's the difference, but most of the time, you'll just use the continuous AF tracking mode. Now, you can also select manual focus. Again, I'll push the AF button here and scroll over to MF mode, which is manual focus mode. And now, even if I push the shutter button halfway, the camera does not try to focus. Instead, I'm going to use the focusing ring on the lens here to focus. So you can see, just by moving it around, it will manually focus. Now, manual focus is pretty hard, but this camera has some focusing assist modes that I'll show you in just a little bit. There's one other mode I want to show you, and that's the way most SLRs behave. Most of the big, like bulky cameras that you might get, and that is single AF plus MF. So with this, you can manually focus, and even when you're also using autofocus. So it kind of gives you the best of both worlds. But I'll warn you that I find myself accidentally hitting the focusing ring on a regular basis, and that can be a little bit annoying. So it depends. Give it a try. I like autofocus plus manual focus. It works pretty well. But if you find you're accidentally manually focusing and it's throwing everything off, just switch back to single autofocus. Now let's talk about the focusing points. By default, the camera will look at the entire scene and try to decide what the most important part of the scene is. It'll decide where to focus for you. And like I showed you earlier, it focused on the camera instead of on Justin's eyes, which is bad. Now, the easiest way to select a specific focusing point is just to touch the screen, and it will focus right on it. You can also use the directional pad here to change the focusing point, even when you're using the electronic viewfinder. So the directional pad tends to be easier when you have your eye up here because it's difficult to kind of like touch the screen. So you use the directional pad instead. The E-M1 also has a face detection feature that will detect that there's a human in the scene and even focus on their eye specifically, and it's on by default. So that should already be working. But earlier when I took a picture of Justin, you can see it didn't figure it out. It took a picture, it focused on the camera instead. So it's good to have it on, but it's not 100%, not by any means. You can adjust it or turn it off if you find it annoying. I'll just show you where that is. Hit the OK button here to bring up this little quick menu. And then you'll just scroll down until you find the face detection priority mode. And you can see normally it's on the little happy face with an eye. And that means it's going to intelligently choose the closest eye. If I scroll to the right here with the directional pad, it will focus on the right eye. And if I choose L, it will focus on the left eye. Now in portraiture, you always focus on the nearest eye. And so that's what the intelligent thing will try to do. But if you know you want to focus on the left eye or the right eye and it's not quite working out for you, you might try manually selecting it, but I wouldn't bother. At that point, I would just switch to manually selecting the focusing point and putting it right on the person's eye. Your other options here are to basically just turn it off completely if you find it annoying. But I never find that it gets in the way, and it's really easy to manually select a focusing point when you need to do that. I also want to show you manual focus assist. As I showed you earlier, you can switch to manual focus. And in the SLR world, those big dinosaur cameras, it's very hard to manually focus because your eye simply can't resolve as well as the camera's autofocus system can. Cameras like the E-M1 allow you to zoom in on the scene and show far more detail than you could see with your eye. Basically, it becomes like a microscope so that you can look at the most minute details and focus just perfectly. To configure manual focus assist, I'll hit the menu button there, go down to the wrench icon, go to the first menu, AF, MF, and then we're going to go down to the last item on the first page, which is MF Assist. So I'll select that, and you can see two options here, magnify and peaking. Magnify zooms in, and I find it the most useful. Peaking highlights areas that are currently in focus. So let's take a look at both of those. I'll turn magnify on. Make sure you select OK after you select it, or else it won't remember it. And now I'll zoom right in there. You can see everything's out of focus. Now, as soon as I start manually focusing, it automatically magnifies it for me. And it just zooms right in there until, oh, there we go. I can see I almost have it. There, I've nailed focus. Now, peaking, let's turn that on now. I'll hit menu again, go down to the wrenches, go to A, last item of the first page. And let's turn peaking on. You can turn them both on at the same time, but for the sake of this example, I'll turn magnify off. Now with peaking on, it's going to draw a highlight around anything that's currently in focus. So there you can see kind of a white outline. Let's choose a different subject. Let's use this little E-M10 here, and I'll focus on that. So if you look at the barrel of the lens there, you can see the lens is getting highlighted as I'm focusing around it. I'll move the camera instead. And you can see there Olympus is highlighted, and there the barrel of the lens is highlighted. And as I go back and further, you can see different parts of the camera are highlighted. So what it's doing is showing you the sharpest parts of the picture to help you focus perfectly. Focus peaking is especially useful in video, where you'll probably want to be manually focusing anyway. You can combine both magnification and focus peaking for even more precision. I'll say focus peaking always shows you a range of what might be in focus. So if you're working with really shallow depth of field lenses, it might not be precise enough, but it's still a helpful guide. So now let's go over the different metering modes. And first I want to reassure you that I tell people never to change the metering modes. The default is almost always fine, especially when you use it along with exposure compensation. But some old school photographers and people who are familiar with spot metering and from the film photography world will want to know where it is. So I will show those people where it is, and the rest of you can just zone out until we get to the next segment. To change the metering mode, there's a button dedicated to it here. It's this thing that looks like, I don't know, like a circle with boxes around it. Push that, and then you can use the secondary dial in the front here to change the metering mode. ESP is the default, and it's the most useful. Center weighted will meter the entire scene off of a small part of the picture in the middle. spot metering uses a very small part of the picture and meters the whole scene around it. So let's look at what spot metering does. You can see this little circle that it's drawing. It's going to meter the entire scene so that that little spot is gray. First, I'll put my camera here in program mode so the auto exposure is working properly. And so now you can see as I zoom in on this, look at the histogram. All this is gray. The screen, you would think, would look bright white, but whatever is in the spot meter is always going to be gray. But watch this. As I go down to the black part of the screen, everything becomes bright. And now that black part of the screen becomes gray. So gray, gray. Whatever's in the middle is gray, but it means your exposure varies wildly. And the reason I don't recommend using spot metering is, imagine you're a wedding photographer, which I am. You'll take a picture of a man in a tux. If the spot meter happens to fall on his black tuxedo, it will make that tuxedo gray, which means it will wildly overexpose the rest of the scene. If it falls on his white shirt, it will make that shirt gray, which means the entire scene will be wildly underexposed. ESP, the default metering mode, does a much, much better job of deciding that, and for that reason, I would always just select ESP. There's lots of information about metering in chapters 3 and 4 of Stunning Digital Photography. Now let's talk about changing ISO. Believe it or not, it is pronounced ISO and not ISO. You can visit the organization's website if you don't believe me, but you should just believe me. ISO controls your sensor's sensitivity in sort of a virtual way. If you use a high ISO number, like ISO 3200, you can take pictures in low light, like at a restaurant or a bar. Use a low ISO number, like ISO 200, when you want to take pictures in full sunlight. Low ISO numbers like ISO 200 will give you very clean pictures with nice, smooth skies and no weird grain or noise. But if you start to shoot at the higher ISOs, like ISO 3200 or 6400, you're going to get a ton of noise and your pictures are generally going to look worse. So for that reason, you always use the lowest ISO you can. But as you start to work in dim environments, you'll pretty much need a higher ISO. ISO is complex, and of course I covered it in the book. But the good news is you don't really have to think about it, because by default, the camera will come configured with auto ISO set up for you. So you could just leave it on that until you get to the point where you want to start manually adjusting the ISO. When you do, the E-M1 allows you to do that really easily. I'm just going to hit the OK button here. And now I'll just scroll down until I get to the ISO mode. Now you can see it shows ISO auto here. Auto is selected. That means it's going to make the decision for me. But I can scroll to the right. You generally don't want to select low. That's equivalent to ISO 100, but it's an extended ISO on this camera, so it reduces the dynamic range. 200 is more ideal for even bright light conditions. And then as we scroll to the right, we'll get noisier and noisier pictures, but we'll be able to take pictures with faster shutter speeds, even in dim light conditions. It will go all the way up to ISO 25,600. And at that ISO, you're going to get very, very noisy pictures that will probably not be usable, but could theoretically take a picture in near darkness. So there's that usefulness to it. Anyway, that's how you change the ISO and configure auto ISO. Oops, I just set it to low. If you do change the ISO, after you're done, I would go back and set it to auto so that the next time you pick up the camera, you won't be surprised by how it behaves. There is one setting related to auto ISO that I want to show you. I'll hit the menu button here, go down to the gear icons, go over to E, and then the last item on the first page allows you to control whether auto ISO is available in manual mode or not. So by default, when you switch to manual mode, it always turns off auto ISO, and you have to set the ISO if you want to control the total exposure. If you want auto ISO to work in manual mode, change this ISO auto from PAS, which is program, aperture priority, and shutter priority modes, change it to all. And now you'll have auto ISO available in manual mode too. You always have the option to turn off auto ISO in any of the modes, but auto ISO in manual mode is useful for times when you want the camera to determine the exposure and you want to control both the aperture and shutter speed. The camera will vary the ISO to give you the exposure that it thinks will work best. Earlier I told you you don't need to worry about metering modes because you can use exposure compensation to manually adjust the brightness of your picture in those situations where the camera makes the picture too bright, overexposes it, or too dark, underexposes it. So to change the exposure compensation, you'll switch to program, aperture, or shutter priority modes. Any of those are fine. And then, by default, you use the secondary dial here in the front to make the picture brighter or darker. So you can see here, it's looking at the screen and it's deciding it should be quite gray. But I would want that screen to be nice and bright. So I'm going to move this secondary dial to the right here until it gets nice and bright. Now you can see I'm looking at that histogram. I want parts of that histogram to be approaching the right side of the picture, almost touching it, just about like that. Now the screen is nice and bright white. If I decide I want the picture to be darker, I'll just roll it to the left until I get the results that I want. Now, the brilliance of the E-M1 and other mirrorless cameras is that you can see the brightness of the picture either on the live view screen or in the electronic viewfinder. So in the DSLR world, you have to take the picture and then you have to look at the picture and then decide, oh, that's too dark. I need to add some exposure compensation and reshoot. But on cameras like these, it's simply brilliant. You just look through the viewfinder and use your finger right here under the shutter and adjust that until the brightness is what you want and the histogram is looking good, not going over the right, but close to touching the right. And then you can snap your picture and you'll already know that the exposure compensation is set to the right thing. Now I'll show you how to bracket your photos. Remember back in the film days, you might not, but back in the film days, you had to wait at least several hours to see your pictures, but most of us had to wait like weeks. And you'd get your pictures back and they would just be too dark. And you'd be like, oh, I blew the exposure. How would I ever know? Well, nowadays, you know exactly what your exposure is going to be before you even take the picture. Well, in the film days, we would cover our butts by taking multiple exposures at different brightnesses. So you take one that was what you thought was the right exposure, and then one that was you thought would be too dark, and then one that would be too bright. And when you're in the darkroom, you would look at the negatives or the slides and be like, okay, this one, I nailed the exposure on this one. I'm going to choose this one of the three. So bracketing takes 3, 5, 7 pictures at different exposures so you can later choose the right brightness. So you don't need that in the digital world, really, except for one thing, and that's what they call HDR photography, high dynamic range photography, which creates these kind of brilliant artistic photos with massive amounts of contrast. HDR photography, besides creating the artistic style that some people find annoying, HDR has a very practical purpose of reducing or eliminating shadow noise. It will allow you to capture all the contrast in a cloudy sky, as well as the detail in the shadow areas, which might otherwise be completely black. Bracketing and HDR are extremely useful, and in fact, there's a whole chapter about them in Stunning Digital Photography. I know, I keep covering it, but I can't go on for 10 hours here. I have to cross-reference at some point. Bracketing is really easy to turn on this camera. It has a button. It's your shutter button here with the little stack of copies. So push that button. This comes up here, and then I'm going to use the secondary dial here on the front to change the mode up here. So here are some default bracketing options. We have, it says 3F 2.0 EV. That means 3 frames, 3 pictures at 2 EV means plus or minus 2 stops. So we'll just start with that. And now I'll take 3 pictures of this screen. I just held the shutter down and took all 3 pictures at once. Now, as I review those pictures, this is the first picture, what the camera thought was the proper exposure. I look at the second picture, it's too dark. The third picture, too bright. I could later copy those pictures to my computer and blend them into HDR. If I push that button again, you'll see there are some other HDR options up here. Besides taking just 3 pictures, you could take 5 pictures or 7 pictures. You could also take 3 or 5 pictures separated by 3 stops of exposure. If you want to just pick one setting while you're experimenting and not have to worry about it, my favorite setting is 5F 2EV. That's 5 pictures at plus or minus 2 stops each. So you get that covers just about any HDR scenario. There aren't too many scenarios where you won't capture every bit of the image in perfect detail. Again, for more information, check out Chapter 11 in Stunning Digital Photography. And before I move on, I'm going to turn bracketing back off. Because if you forget to set it back to the default, you're going to be annoyed the next time you pick up your camera and you just want to take one picture and you end up bracketing with different exposures. This camera does not have a flash built in. Instead, they've given you a fidgety little thing that you can put up here. That flash is appalling. It's awful. You'll get just terrible, terrible light out of it. Instead, I would recommend getting an external flash that attaches here. It has a bigger head. It moves the light further away from the lens and will give you a much more pleasing light. If you do attach a flash, you can control the brightness of the flash by using the flash exposure compensation menu. So I'll click the OK button here and scroll down until I see the flash exposure compensation icon. There we go. There's the flash menu. And you can see it's symbolized by a lightning bolt and then plus or minus. And this works just like exposure compensation. If you take a picture and it has too much flash, if the flash is blinding people and washing out everybody's faces, you'll just go left. So -1 means half the light. -2 means 1/4 the light. These work in stops. It's logarithmic. If you want more light from your flash, you'll crank it over to the right. This is how you use flash exposure compensation. And that's how you change the setting anyway. If you want to find out how to actually use it and get the best results, it's chapter 3 in Stunning Digital Photography. Another setting that you don't have to worry about, but that I feel obligated to tell you about, is changing the white balance. Now, the white balance, this is a complex concept to understand, so prepare to have your mind blown a little bit. But white is not always white. Under the sunlight, the sun is giving out pretty even amounts of red, blue, and green light. And so we could look at this table or a white piece of paper and say, that's white. You could bring that same piece of paper into your house under incandescent light, and it would still look white. But the thing is, it's not the same white, because incandescent lights give off more red than the blue and green. So it actually ends up looking a little bit orange. Now, your brain accounts for that. Your brain figures out, hey, I'm under orange colored light. I'm going to make orange look white. So yes, your brain is tricking you. Different light sources have different white balances. They have different color temperatures, they'll also call it. And your brain will make them all look the same. The camera will do the same thing. The camera has auto white balance that will figure out what kind of light it's under and make white look white again. This works fine. And I'll show you later how to set the camera to take RAW pictures instead of JPEG pictures. That means that even if the camera guesses wrong, you can fix it on your computer later with no penalty. And whenever I can, I prefer to fix things in post so that I can focus on composition and emotion and other and more important parts of the picture than the technical details. But if you're the type who wants to change the white balance, now I'll show you where that is. I'll just hit the OK button here, go down, keep scrolling down until I find the white balance setting. There we go, white balance. You can see it's on auto by default. If I scroll to the right, you'll see sunny day, shadow, cloudy, incandescent light, fluorescent light. Look at, there's even an underwater setting in case you get an underwater housing. Your camera is not waterproof, it's splash resistant. By default, you'll want to just leave it on the auto. Otherwise, you can pick the setting that matches the scenario that you happen to be in. Now I'll talk about recording video with this camera. This is a very capable video camera that records HD video. You can simply do whatever you're doing, set up all your settings, and then hit the record button here, and it will start recording video. You really don't have to worry about anything else. However, the camera does have a dedicated movie mode, which shows you a little bit more information on the screen. So let's look at the little old-timey film projector. I don't know why we decide on symbols that are like 60 years old, but I don't think kids nowadays would even know what a reel-to-reel projector was, but that means recording videos for whatever reason. And when I do, you can see it changes the information that I see on the screen. As always, I can hit the info button to show different sets of information. So now, once again, I can just focus on something and record. And that's basically all there is to it. You can zoom and refocus automatically, just as you would when you were taking still photos. Even though I had it set to single focus mode, you can see in video mode, it will try to hunt and find focus. It's not going to be great at tracking a fast moving subject, but it will do its best. There are a couple of video options, and I'm just going to show you the menu because you won't generally have to touch these, but I'll hit the menu button, go down to the wrench, scroll to the second page where I is movie, and scroll to the right again. And here are your movie options. Earlier we talked about program, aperture priority mode, shutter priority mode, and manual mode. When you're in the movie mode here, you select which of those priorities you're going to choose. by selecting this and then going maybe to aperture, shutter, or manual mode. This controls whether the main dial controls your aperture or your shutter speed. The other settings here are things you probably won't ever need to change, but you can, for example, turn off the internal microphone, which should be fine, or turn on wind reduction if you're in a windy environment. The SD card here is your digital film, and it can store hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of pictures, depending on the size of the memory card. Eventually, you'll fill it up. At that point, you want to copy all your pictures to your computer, back them up safely, and then reformat the memory card so you can reuse it. To format the memory card, hit the menu button here, go to the first camera icon, go to Card Setup, and then select Format. Once you click that, it'll just erase all the pictures that you've taken. I don't want to erase it just yet. If you accidentally erase all your pictures, there's a free tool that can rescue them for you called Photo Rec. There's a video showing you how to use it in Chapter 5 of STP. If you don't pay for the book, just go Google Photo Rec. It's a free tool. Don't pay for a tool. I'm going to show you how to disable that beep now because I find that beep really annoying. Hit the menu, select the wrench icon, scroll down to D, scroll to the right, and then on the third page down, you'll see this little universal sound icon. Scroll to the right here and please turn that off. I hate the beep. I'm a wedding photographer. There's always a crowd of people trying to take a picture of their niece getting married and the camera's beep, beep, beep. Very annoying. One of the most important settings, besides disabling that beep, is shooting RAW. RAW images capture all the data from your camera sensor, allowing you to process them on the computer and rescue shots that are overexposed or underexposed, fix the white balance in post instead of when you're shooting. They take up more space, but they create much better results. Of course, I covered in Chapter 4, Stunning Digital Photography. To switch over to RAW mode, I'm clicking OK here and then scrolling down until I see this option. Right now it says LN, which means large pictures with normal quality. One to the left is a better option, which is large pictures with fine quality. All the way to the left is the best option, which is RAW. You'll need an application like the free Google Picasa or the paid Adobe Lightroom to process those pictures, but you're going to need one of those apps anyway. And then they handle it completely automatically. It's very easy to share even RAW photos, but again, much better quality, cleaner pictures too. Now there are lots of customizable buttons on this camera. That's my favorite thing about the E-M1 is all the buttons you can use. As you get serious about photography, you'll find yourself jumping into some of those menu items quite often. And so it's really nice to be able to change the control, change the behavior of this switch here or several other buttons. To customize that, I'll hit the menu button here. And then we'll go down to the wrench icon, and the second item down, B, is button dial lever. As I scroll to the right, you can see I have options for button function, dial directions if you don't like the left and right, the lever function, and how the different buttons behave with the different lever modes. So I'm not going to go through all of those because they're pretty self-explanatory, but I'll select button function here and just show you how you can change the function of FN1, this button right here. So I'll select FN1 and scroll to the right. And by default, it's set to AF area select, which is useful. But if you would rather switch to manual focus mode when you push that button, select MF. There's a variety of different options here that allow you to really configure how the camera behaves and customize it to your own personal shooting style. So I actually like AF area select. Feel free to customize all the buttons and the switch. But you might want to wait until you spend some time with the camera because you'll figure out then what your shooting style requires of it and those features that you access the most. You can use this camera to record pictures on an interval, which is perfect for taking star trail pictures or a time-lapse movie, which I discuss in Chapter 10 of Stunning Digital Photography. So I'll just show you how to turn it on now. This means you don't have to get an external timer. I recommend buying one, but this camera's got it built in, which is awesome. Hit the menu button, and then on camera 2, you'll see time-lapse settings here. Scroll down to that, select on, and then scroll to the right again. Now you can configure your time-lapse, and this is pretty self-explanatory. Frame is the number of pictures that it's going to take once you start it. You can take up to 999 pictures. Start waiting time is the delay before it starts taking pictures. You could have it wait hours before it starts taking pictures. And then the interval time is how long it waits between pictures. The last option here, time-lapse movie, takes those individual pictures and stitches them together into a movie. If you don't do that, you can take the individual pictures and then process them together on your computer. So if you're doing a Star Trails time lapse, what I would do is switch to manual mode, select a shutter speed of 30 seconds, make sure that the exposure and ISO and everything are set up to get one good picture. And then once you've got the ISO and exposure set, go into the menu system and turn on the time lapse with a 1 second interval. That will essentially keep shooting until you stop the camera. You might as well set the frame to the highest amount because you can just turn the camera off when you're done taking pictures. If you just hit the shutter button or you hit the menu button, it will not remember your time-lapse settings, so be sure to click OK. So because I clicked OK, it's now set to on. When you're done with that, be sure to turn it to off because you don't want to try to take a picture and instead start an interval timer. This camera does have a built-in HDR feature. I don't recommend using it. Instead, I recommend using bracketing, as we discussed earlier, and then referring to Chapter 11 in Stunning Digital Photography for how to process those bracketed pictures. In Chapter 1, Chelsea has a project that shows you how to use multiple exposures to create really creative pictures. And I'm just going to show you how to turn on those multiple exposures. Hit the menu button here to bring that up. And then also on camera 2, right above the time lapse, there's a multiple exposure option here. So choose how many frames you want to select, set the auto gain to off, and with that enabled, you'll be able to take multiple exposures as Chelsea shows you. Once again, when you're done, you want to be sure that you go ahead and turn that off. When you want to clean the sensor, sometimes you'll get dust on your sensor and you'll see little spots in your pictures. Chapter 5 of SDP shows that. To clean the sensor, just take the lens off and that reveals the sensor. There's no need to worry about turning on a special cleaning mode or anything. The camera does a pretty good job of keeping itself dust-free, especially if you don't change your lenses a lot, but inevitably you'll end up with some dust on your pictures. Now we'll go over some lens and tripod suggestions. I absolutely love the Micro Four Thirds system. They have a fantastic set of lenses. In fact, there might be too many to easily navigate, so I'm just going to make some quick recommendations. First, I want to mention that you can use both Olympus and Panasonic lenses on your cameras. In fact, other manufacturers will make Micro Four Thirds lenses too, like Midicon and Zhongyi, different Chinese companies mostly. But for the most part, you'll probably end up with a good selection of Panasonic and Olympus lenses. They both work equally well. The Olympus lenses tend to be, well, the Olympus zoom lenses tend to be a better match because they don't have image stabilization built in. You have that built into your body, so you don't need it. The Panasonic zoom lenses tend to have IS, which is just unnecessary for your camera. My favorite lens for Micro Four Thirds in the world is the Panasonic 20mm f1.7. It's a great little all-in-one general prime lens. It's a fixed lens, so you can't zoom it, but it's very fast. It works great in low light, and it's nice and small and compact, which just makes it perfect to carry. It runs you about $250 new, but you might go looking for the first edition of this rather than the Mark II used. It's a little bit sharper, and they hold up really well. You can get one at sdp.io/020, and we get a few pennies out of every dollar that you spend. If you want a great portrait lens, check out the 45mm f1.8 for about $400. It's a prime lens, but it makes just a fantastic headshot. We have this lens, but I can't show it to you because I'm filming on it right here. That's how much I love the lens. It's my main camera lens here. It takes pictures with just beautiful background blur, and it works great in low light. A step up from that, in both price and quality, is this fantastic Olympus 75mm f1.8. It blurs the background like crazy. It's a little bit longer, which gives more flattering proportions for portraits, and I think it's the sharpest Micro Four Thirds lens I've ever used. It's unbelievably sharp. Feels great too. $900 at that URL. I also want to recommend a more all-in-one zoom lens, perfect for travel. The 14 to 150mm lens. It'll run you about $600. If you feel like the kit lens that your camera came with doesn't reach far enough, this lens will give you more reach and pretty good quality. It's not going to be as sharp as those primes I recommended. It's also not going to be as good in low light, but if you could only have one lens on your camera, it should be that. The lens I've been demonstrating here is the Olympus 12 to 40mm f2.8. It's a general step up from a kit lens. It will give you slightly sharper results and better images in low light because it has a lower f-stop number of f2.8. It runs you about $1,000, which is It's overpriced, frankly. But you can pick one up at sdp.io/040. And if things like the differences in the f-stops doesn't make sense to you, check out my photography buying guide. I explain all of that. Here's a great value on a tripod, $46, a tripod that might last you forever. The Dolica GX600B200. What a catchy name. You can pick it up at sdp.io/Dolica. I love that little hook that it has on the bottom. It's a lightweight tripod, but you can use that to hang your bag from, and it makes the whole tripod more steady. Great for long exposures at night. Also, I want to suggest an upgrade to the strap, because I hate the strap that comes with it that says like Olympus all over it. You just look like such a tourist. My favorite strap to use is the Peak Design Slide. We did a full review that you can find on YouTube of different straps, but this was my favorite. Go to sdp.io/slide to pick one up. And finally, one last plug for my 3 books. You can pick them all up at sdp.io/store. We ship worldwide. Or just go to Amazon. That's a great place to check out the reviews too. I think you'll find that most people really like them and they present a really good value. If you want to see more free videos, you don't have to buy a thing. Just click subscribe. It also helps me out if you click like, just to let other people know that you liked it. And please share with your friends. Share that sdp.io/tutorials link so they can find a tutorial specific to their camera. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions about the camera, feel free to write a comment below and I'll get back to you. See ya.